When the Bolsheviks came to power, most of the population of Russia lived in the villages, enjoying a pretty miserable standard of living. Most peasants were only just able to feed their families with what they produced. The freezing Russian winters made productive agriculture an impossibility. A decision taken by Lenin in 1918 inflicted an even worse disaster on millions of peasants who were already living in poverty. Private property was forbidden, and the peasants' goods were to be confiscated by the state. Lenin carried out that policy by means of another right-hand man, Felix Dzerzhinsky, the head of the Cheka, well known for his ruthlessness. Cheka officers descended on villages all over Russia and began rounding up peasants' crops and livestock at gunpoint. A quota to be handed over by every peasant and given to the Bolsheviks was drawn up. In order to meet that quota, most of them had to give up all that they possessed. Peasants who protested were silenced by the most savage means. On 14 February 1922, one inspector who visited the Omsk region wrote, "Abuses of position by the requisitioning detachments, frankly speaking, have now reached unbelievable levels. Systematically, the peasants who are arrested are all locked up in big, unheated barns. They are then whipped and threatened with execution. Those who have not filled the whole of their quota are bound and forced to run naked all along the main street of the village and then locked up in another unheated hangar." Lenin was enraged when he realized that the quota set for the villages would not be met. In 1920, he inflicted a fearful punishment on some regions that had resisted the requisitions. Not only would these peasants' crops be seized, but also all the seeds they possessed. Confiscating the seeds meant that the peasants would be unable to produce a new crop. In other words, they would have nothing to eat. Then the famine began. 29 million people within the borders of Russia battled with starvation. In 1921 and 1922, 5 million starved agonizingly to death. Lenin watched what was happening with enormous pleasure. In his view, the famine was most useful. He calculated that it would help to destroy people's belief in God and religion and make them bow their heads to communism. In the Black Book of Communism that sent shockwaves around the world, that devilish idea of Lenin's is discussed thus. As one of his friends later recalled, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov had the courage to come out and say openly that famine would have numerous positive results. Famine, he explained, would bring about the next stage more rapidly and usher in socialism, the stage that necessarily followed capitalism. Famine would also destroy faith not only in the Tsar, but in God too. This is what Lenin wrote to the members of the Politburo on March 19, 1922. The present moment favors us. With the help of all those starving people who are starting to eat each other, who are dying by the millions, and whose bodies litter the roadside all over the country, it is now and only now that we can and therefore must confiscate all church property with all the ruthless energy we can muster. Our only hope is the despair engendered in the masses by the famine. which will cause them to look at us in a favorable light, or, at the very least, with indifference. These communications in the Soviet archives have revealed that Lenin deliberately brought about that dreadful famine which cost 5 million lives. That is the same conclusion arrived at by the historian Richard Pipes, who spent years researching the archives in his book, The Unknown Lenin. In his view, for humankind at large, Lenin had nothing but scorn. Individual human beings held for Lenin almost no interest, and he treated the working class much as a metal worker treated iron ore. The reason why Lenin and the other Bolsheviks were so utterly ruthless was the dialectical materialist philosophy they so believed in. This philosophy regarded human beings as a kind of animal and maintained that violence and conflict were necessary for the development of mankind. Not only did Lenin regard human beings as a species of animal, he also employed animal methods to train them. In October 1919, he paid a personal visit to the Russian scientist Ivan Pavlov, famous for his conditioned reflex experiments on animals. Lenin wanted to impose these conditioned reflex methods on the whole of Russian society. Pavlov was astounded. "I want the masses of Russia to follow a communistic pattern of thinking and reacting," Lenin explained. Pavlov was astounded. It seemed that Lenin wanted him to do for humans what he had already done for dogs. "Do you mean that you would like to standardize the population of Russia? Make them all behave in the same way?" he asked. "Exactly," replied Lenin. "Man can be corrected. Man can be made what we want him to be." The so-called scientific basis for that philosophy that regarded human beings as a species of animal was Darwin's theory of evolution. The theory of evolution was the most important ideological inspiration behind the communist movement in Russia. Darwin's The Origin of Species was translated into Russian at the end of the 19th century and was responsible for thousands of young Russians turning to atheism and communism. Russian communism was so tied to Darwinism that Georgy Valentinovich Plekhanov, widely regarded as the founder of the movement, clearly stated that he regarded Marxism as Darwinism in its application to social science. Plekhanov's student, Lenin, indeed applied Darwinism to society, and mercilessly slaughtered whole societies he regarded as herds of animals. The truth is that human beings are not a species of animal, but are honorable beings created by God in possession of a soul. The reason for their existence on earth is not, as communists and Darwinists would assert, conflict, war, and bloodshed, but for them to display a morality that is pleasing to God. Only when man has understood this concept, in other words, only when he lives by true religion, will he find peace and happiness. The end of Lenin, who denied that fact, is a terrible warning. From 1922 on, an increasingly serious sickness slowly began to paralyze him. He spent most of 1923 in a wheelchair, suffering from terrible headaches. In March 1923, he had a stroke and was thenceforth unable to speak normally. In the final months of his life, those who saw Lenin were terrified. His face had taken on a peculiar expression, and he was half mad. The final photograph taken of him shortly before his death was utterly ghastly. God speaks of the fate of such cruel people in the Quran. Then the final fate of those who did evil will be the worst, because they denied God's signs and mocked at them. Lenin died on January 21, 1924. The Bolsheviks organized a huge funeral ceremony for Lenin. The leaders of the Communist Party decided to have his body, which had a tremendous importance for them, embalmed. Among those bearing Lenin's coffin was the next dictator of Soviet Russia, Joseph Stalin. Stalin would rule Soviet Russia for nearly 30 years and establish a regime of such bloodshed and terror that would even surpass that of Lenin. All the historical facts we have so far considered have an important moral for mankind. False ideas can lead to disasters for people and societies. Communism is one such false idea, and it inflicted dreadful suffering on the world during the 20th century. One of the fundamental errors of communism is that it believes conflict to be an unchanging law of nature. The so-called scientific justification for this view is found in the theory of evolution, which says that the differences between people necessarily lead to war, fighting, and conflict. According to this view, called dialectics, every class, every nation, and every society is obliged to fight every other one, and this is a law of nature. That view stamped its mark all over the 20th century, and is the common inspiration behind both the communist savagery we have seen in this film, and also behind that of fascism, which appears to be the complete opposite of communism. It is only possible for mankind to escape this cycle of violence by coming to know the purpose behind his existence. Human beings are not a species of animal that emerged by chance and live only to fight, as Darwinists, communists, and fascists believe. Human beings are noble beings, created by God, and possessing His soul. And the purpose of man is to learn and to live by that pleasing morality that God has taught him. In the next section, we shall continue to examine the disasters that communist ideology, which rejects that truth, has inflicted on humanity. The Bloody History of Communism, Part 2. Stalin's regime of fear, death camps, and secret murders. The Soviet-Russian genocide of Muslims. Stalin's scientists killed for refusing to accept the theory of evolution. Do not miss The Bloody History of Communism, Part 2.